Hello everyone. This is November the 2nd, 2010, and this is episode 2 of A Day in the Life of a Linux User. Now, today I'd like to talk about operating systems, mostly free operating systems, free open source software operating systems. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the history leading up to that. And I'm just going to briefly mention the proprietary systems that I used before, the FOSS operating systems. Before they were really available, we had to use something, and they were all proprietary. That's just the way it was. Okay, so let's go back to the very first Unix, and I'm going to mostly concentrate on Unix and Unix-like systems, but I'm also going to talk a bit about other alternatives. Now, I don't really think that people understand what are all the alternatives. Everybody, nowadays, what is everybody running? Well, most people are running Microsoft Windows of one version or another. Now, and it's kind of irritating a little bit to me because there are a lot of choices out there now. There's really no excuse just to run Microsoft Windows or have every computer in your office or in the schools and have every single computer running some type of Microsoft Windows. I don't think that's a good idea, and I don't think it's very smart for the businesses or the schools or even individuals to do that. I think it's kind of a waste of their money, really. And I don't know, it's not clear to me how educational that is. You can't look at the source code and you can't modify it and then compile your own versions. You're very limited. And for a long time I was in that was the position that I was in also. I was stuck in the proprietary software and I couldn't get out. I wasn't even aware that there was a good alternative. Okay, so let's start in 1986, and there was Venix, VENIX, for the IBM XT. So this is like a Intel 8086 CPU with, I think it was 512K memory and a CGA video card. It had a color monitor, but and the keyboard was good. But let's face it, it was pretty primitive. It really couldn't do any multimedia, and you were limited to the graphics of the character set. Whatever the video card ROM supported. You couldn't do bitmap graphics. And this is what I had exposure to, and it was interesting. It had awk and text processing capabilities. Mainly it was a text-based operating system, but it was proprietary. Okay, in 1986 I wasn't savvy enough to realize what an impediment that was. I had no aspirations on, I'm going to compile my own operating system, or I'm going to compile my own operating system with the changes that I've added. It didn't occur to me at the time. Okay, so after that, just briefly, SEO Unix System 5, which I encountered in 1988. And, okay, so now it's running on 386s. Okay, 386s at the time in 1988 were quite expensive. So, again, we just didn't see the free open source software for operating systems at that time. Now, I know that Net 1 came out in about June 1989. Okay, so that was when we first started to see the idea of open source software, but not too many people knew about it. And I never actually ran Net 1. I only now know in retrospect that Net 1 came out in June 1989, and that was based on BSD, which is the Berkeley Software Distribution, which is a version of Unix, and that was running on, I think that was running on 386s at the time. So You know, that was like the very beginning of it. Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead. I used a few other systems as well, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. I used some IBM mainframe systems that ran CMS, and they had interesting features, and I'm going to talk about that another time, but I'm just going to stick with mostly Unix based and then the alternatives that came later. All right, so what happened after that? Well, there was a few things that happened in 1990. We had Amix came out, which was an AT&T Unix System 5 Release 4 for Amigas, okay, which was proprietary, all right, and there were some problems with it. Like it was, of course, it's proprietary, and it didn't really take advantage of the multimedia capabilities of the Amigas. Okay, at the time, I guess they had Amiga 2000 and Amiga 2500, and they might have even had Amiga 3000 by that time. Yeah, I think they did. They had Amiga 3000 UX, but it didn't really take advantage of the multimedia capabilities of the Amiga hardware, and it just was a dud. No, hardly anybody used it, and it cost $7,000 to get an Amiga 3000 UX, so very expensive. And okay, so around maybe just before that time, I saw Sun 4s running at the University of Waterloo. And this is in the late 80s, so around just maybe before that. But of course, that's proprietary too. That's running Sun OS, which is a Unix, and still proprietary though. So, okay, what was the big change? Okay, well, Prentice Hall did a deal with Andrew Tannenbaum, and they had Minix. They came out with a book that would explain everything about the Minix OS. It was a microkernel OS, and now we're starting to get into open source stuff. And I tried it at the time, and I had a lot of problems. I think my main problem with it was I couldn't get CD-ROM working at the time, so I kind of gave up on it. But I got my first look at an open source system, open source operating system. So I would come back to that. I'll come back to Minix, but that was like my very first exposure to it. So this was in the early, maybe 1992, 1993. Okay, in 1994, I tried Darkstar 0.99, which is just before version 1, and that is a Linux. It's a GNU Linux distribution. That was the very first real Linux that I tried, and I did some stuff with it. I had end cursors, and I messed around with it a little bit. I didn't really do anything serious with Darkstar. So, and then what happened after that? Well, after that came what I would call the dark ages, where there wasn't, Commodore went bankrupt in 1994, and a lot of bad things happened. Okay, and Microsoft basically dominated everything. We're talking about the years from 1995 to early 2000s, and that's all I saw, for a long time. And I know that there was other stuff happening. Net 2 came out, which was the successor to Net 1. I didn't use it though, and then eventually the BSDs split. And there was 3 BSDs: NetBSD, OpenBSD, and FreeBSD. And so that's healthy. All 3 of those are still alive and doing very well. So anybody who wants BSD can certainly now they can get it, no problem. And it's good. But okay, jumping back to the dark ages. Basically, we had a bunch of bad stuff happen with Win modems and Win-only scanners, which meant that the scanner would only run on Windows. And it was a real problem for me at the time. I remember thinking, this is just the pits. Like Commodore is dead and no more Amigas. And what are the alternatives? And Microsoft just seemed to take over everything at that time. So I'll go jump ahead. And I thought, and the whole time of this was happening, I was thinking, this is not good. This is not the way computers should be. But that's the way it was back then. 95 to say 2003, you know, for me. Now I know that a lot of people used Linux earlier than 2003, and including myself, but I wasn't serious about it at the time. It wasn't until early 2003 that I started using Linux again. In my case, I used Red Hat 8, okay, and it had KDE version 3.0, I believe, and it had GNOME version 2, and it was pretty good. I was impressed. I liked it. I liked it a lot, and I used it for a very long time. In fact, eventually, the computer that I had that used to run Red Hat 8, which is a Intel P3 dual processor system. It's dual 550 megahertz CPU, and okay, so eventually I went off Red Hat 8 and I started using Fedora Core 1 in 2004, and it's still running. It's still running Fedora Core 1 to this day. So it's been running it for over 6 years, and it runs really well. I've had uptimes of about a year, and usually the only time the system goes down, I don't change anything on the hardware. I just leave it alone. The only thing that I found, sometimes I had a couple of times when the power supply popped on me, and I had a couple of times when the UPS died because the power failure was so long. The UPS just ran out of power, and the system went down. So those, other than that, it was a very, very stable system, and it's still running. It's running right beside me to this day. So this is 2010, and I started doing that in FC1. I put it on in 2004. The operating system has not blown its brains out in that entire time. So it's been the longest install of any operating system that I've ever used that still works. Okay, so after that, and that system has about 320 megs of RAM. It doesn't really have that much RAM in it, and it still works good. Okay, so I did a few experiments after that with Slackware, or rather BL3, on a 16 meg computer, which was IBM EduQuest from 1993. And that I did about a year ago. It's running FreeDOS, and it's running BL3, which is a distribution based on Slackware 4. And it ran really well, and mostly that was for old DOS games. You know, that's old hardware with ISA cards, and it works good for that. So, some thumbs up for FreeDOS. That was an open source re-implementation of MS-DOS, so I really like that a lot. Now, in the case of just going back to Fedora Core 1 briefly, I shoehorned KDE 3.4.2 onto that system. Even though originally it was running KDE 3.0, I was still able to run 3.4.2 on FC1, and it took forever to compile, but it works fine. I'm still using it, and I don't really have any inclination to upgrade on that. I'm just going to keep it. It's my server, and it'll just keep running, and eventually, you know, I guess the motherboard will die, and then I'll probably do something different. But I used a whole bunch of other Fedoras. I used 5, 6, I used 8. I have Fedora 10 currently running on a Panasonic Toughbook CF48, and it's working very good. The only problem with Fedora 10 is they did away with the whole KDE 3.x system. They changed to KDE 4, and I didn't like KDE 4, so I just left it in GNOME. I just leave it in GNOME all the time. I don't want the new KDE. I don't like it. That's just the way it is. The other system I have is another P3 system, which is running KDE 3.5.10, which was the newest of the KDE 3 systems. So KDE 3.5.10 running on Vector Linux, and it has a 2.6 kernel, 2.6.27. Okay, and those are running good, and that pretty much brings us up to date with that. Now, okay, now I'm going to go back to my earlier point about the fact that I'm hooking up with some of my former